Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 29th installment of Encyclopedia Hermetica, a big history. Today I've got Mitch with me,
Hello.
and we will be discussing, Brett actually is here as well. He will be joining us in a bit. We will be discussing the Hellenistic age, and specifically the Hellenistic kings, the successor kings of Alexander, who basically divvied up Alexander's territories after Alexander's death and picked at it sort of like a vulture picks at a carcass. So, how, Mitch, did this process begin? I mean, we had no clear successor. We had a half-wit and a youngin, too young to come to the throne.
Barely born by the time he actually did. And again, going back, that was Alexander the Fourth, who, when Alexander the Great died, was still unborn. So a lot of what the potential outcomes they were looking for involved was that he was born a boy. So that's where we kind of left off. And I mean, we got down to the Battle of Ipsus, which was 301, which leads us back again into the 3rd century, which is a rocky start for us as far as sources go, because for the next 20-ish years after Ipsus, we don't have a lot. At least not in the East, for sure, which is what I'm most aware of. The Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire.
Right.
So really with the successors, we can expect probably the same, more conflict over territories. After the final division at Ipsus, we have more empires than we need to be used to yet, especially with characters like Lysimachus in the north, who my favorite king, that would be Seleucus, well, my favorite kingdom, the Seleucids. Seleucus has gone on a conquering rampage. At this time, I would argue that he was one of the more successful people in the world, at least in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, he definitely had the richest province by far, and the largest by far.
Second maybe only to Egypt.
I don't even think it was poorer than Egypt in any way.
No, it's tough to say. Egypt is traditionally the rich of the kingdoms.
Mm-hmm.
They were the ones known for their opulence, and with good reason, because they knew how to manage and do taxations. So the Seleucids, however, Seleucus was almost an indomitable force. I think he conquered the entire East. He brought order to chaos in that wake after Ipsus, and he gained for himself the largest of all of the kingdoms at the time. Now with the Seleucids, it doesn't last, but he dies on his way to Macedonia to reconquer there as well. And he dies, I believe, the Battle of Kynos-Kephali, which is where he kills Lysimachus. Now some people might remember Lysimachus being one of the successors who held a kingdom which essentially encompassed Thrace at the time and part of what is now Turkey, so around the Hellespontine area. Kynos-Kephali, he's killed. Lysimachus is, and Seleucus makes his move towards Macedonia, where he is met by a bastard son of Ptolemy the First, who we call Ptolemy Karanos the Thunderbolt, wherein Karanos kills Seleucus the First, stabs him in the back in a figurative sense probably, but maybe in a literal sense, I'm not sure. And Antiochus the First takes control of the kingdom for the Seleucids, but we have now this pretender Ptolemy trying to become the king of Macedon. It doesn't work out well for him very shortly after. He's also killed by the troops. He tries to declare himself the king of Macedonia.
Right.
Immediately after that.
And the troops are a very important element in this whole thing. I mean, they are the Macedonian people abroad.
Yeah.
And it is the Macedonian people who decide who they're going to let rule over them.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we talked about this a bit before, about the army assemblies, the so-called army assemblies, and how kings came to kingship. And even if there was directly no role in the army constitutionally or legally electing a king. Certainly, people who don't want to be ruled have trouble being ruled. We might look not too long after this in the future to the Egyptian revolt against the Ptolemies, where they teach them to use weapons and use them at the Battle of Raphia in 217. And not long after that, they revolt because they've now learned. But in any case, with the army assemblies and the army as it is, as you say, these are the Macedonians. And for Macedonian kings, such as all of these successors were, it was important for them to have a core of Macedonian soldiers. So everything that was Alexander's has been divided up, and there are Macedonians everywhere you can think of. For at least a while yet, I'm not really sure how they're affected by being abroad. I don't think they could have stayed, quote-unquote, pure Macedonians forever. Certainly there would be a lot of people claiming Macedonian descent, and perhaps some claiming Macedonian citizenship of some kind, wherein they're actually from X or Y.
Yeah.
But that it is an interesting question, and how kingship is supported by it.
But I mean, it might be possible, because we need to remember that this age, this Hellenistic age, was an age of diaspora.
Yeah.
So this is a great Greek diaspora. The idea was that, lands as far as Afghanistan had been opened up for Greek commerce, Greek travel, and Greek immigration as well. And so you could either be, a landless peasant or some farmer of a 5-acre lot of rocky soil, or you could go out and be a princeling in Afghanistan. And that was something that a lot of people did at the time. So I don't know if necessarily they would have been alone out in the frontier world.
Mm-hmm.
It had been some time. There had been an opening up of the East to the Greeks, and the Greeks actually flowed in that direction.
Certainly, and I think a major contributor to this spread, both in the Ptolemaic hierarchy and the Seleucid hierarchy, is the clericy system, wherein soldiers would be given plots of land to work, which essentially became hereditary in a sense, the expectation being that there would be continued military service.
Right.
Within the Ptolemaic context, we have a system that is much better refined, wherein they tax them at every level of government. They are expected to continue servicing. And I have read, actually, in an article, I think, one of the Cambridge series talks about how the Ptolemaic system sort of led into their decline because the clerics became too hereditary.
This is sort of mirroring the Sipahi system in the Ottoman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same sort of deal. The grandsons of great knights aren't usually great knights.
They occupy the land and they may do military service, but that can only go on for so long. And that's one of the issues I'm looking at in writing my thesis, is that I'm trying to determine who is a mercenary, because mercenaries would also get this deal. We might look to the Cretan mercenaries, who were extremely popular at the period. The Seleucids used them every campaign up until Magnesia, where they lost the right to recruit them, even though they may not have stopped. But we know that they were settled in rural areas, they were settled in cities. I believe Miletus is where some of the Cretans were given land, actually in the city itself. And determining who's who, where they've come from, what their ethnicity is, even what they self-identify as, it becomes a big issue. And that carries through society, through military structure, how the kingdom itself operates based on this spreading of people and how they got to where they are. And one of Alexander's major policies as he moved eastward in his campaigns was to leave garrisons behind. For obvious reasons, you leave a garrison to hold down an area to ensure your back is secured. But what Alexander liked to do was he liked to leave them on the fronts of his territories, on his very boundaries, to establish himself. And that's something the Seleucids definitely, I think, did with these military settlements, especially the clericies. So for a more perfect model of clericy, we might look to the Ptolemies, but the Seleucids certainly had their own problems or not. And the practice of using clericies is not new by any means. And the 5th century Athenians did it with territories on the Ionian coast. We might look also to the Spartan system, where the Spartans used clericies given to Spartan citizens. The actual Spartans fighters would receive a clericy on birth, and it would be worked by helots, that sort of thing. So we have this economical system where citizens, people who contribute directly to the machine of the empire, are rewarded with essentially a way to make a living.
Right.
So that's a big contributor to that spread, I think, relocation and pushing people around. So
yeah. So I want to talk for a bit about the successor kingdoms independently, but first I wanted to mention how this era marks a change in the philosophy of rulership. That these kings, who would each be rulers of very great empires in their own respects, they were not hereditary heirs to any throne.
Mm-hmm.
They were not part of any dynasties. They were not even necessarily themselves the conquerors of those areas. They were purely self-proclaimed, and then they played the part. There was nobody kind of arguing legitimacy for them. They were doing it themselves,
mm-hmm.
and they were their own propagandists, and they were extremely successful. And basically, they just, I don't know, they manifested their own royalty out of thin air, and then the only way that they maintained their rule was by ruling somewhat according to the dictates of Hellenistic philosophy. So, like, as I discussed in the last lecture, Stoicism was the kind of unanimous philosophy of the Hellenistic rulers, and they all incorporated the Stoic doctrines into their rulership. And what happened was there was this change from you are a king because you are born that way. Now you are a king because you have the virtues of a king. And that kingship is not this divine thing. It doesn't come from another world. It's purely because you express the characteristics of a ruler. And I think that's a very dynamic difference from what we had before, especially in places like Pharaonic Egypt. And of course, that isn't to say that they wouldn't pick up on these old notions of pharaohs, and this kind of led into the whole highly incestuous character of the Ptolemies. They were very incestuous on account of that the pharaohs did it. And the pharaohs were separate and distinct from the rest of mankind. They did not abide by the same rules as everyone else. And so they can have sex with their sisters and keep that bloodline tight. And that's something the Ptolemies picked up on. So they let it get to their heads over time. But I think initially it was a matter of you're a ruler because you rule.
Yeah,
not because you're born one.
I think this splits kind of into two interesting questions. The first being, what is legitimacy to a Hellenistic king? And the second being, how did Hellenistic kings interpret traditions in the areas that they rule? How did their environment affect their style of rulership, which more comes up, I think, for me, for the Ptolemies than anywhere else. But as far as legitimacy goes, that one's a tough one to call, because all of the successors in some way had a connection to the original Argead family, the original Macedonian blood, directly or mostly indirectly. So I think by that claim, they might have tried to play that up. Might have said that they were members of the royal house, the lower Macedonians, the upper Macedonian royal houses, and they tried to connect themselves to Alexander. That's everyone except Cassander. Cassander didn't want to be associated with Alexander at all. The way primarily that they would force their legitimacy to rule, I think, were through the same principles that Macedonian kings had thus far, by support of the army.
Yes.
So military is 100% the most important factor in determining kingship.
Yes.
Are you a competent leader can you conquer lands, and can you be everything that an army needs you to be? So we see the idea of the spear won land, which is the Doriktetos Kora in Greek. And this principle being a good king will fight battles and will claim their kingship over a domain based on winning it through that battle. So Alexander was a big proponent of this. That's why everywhere he conquered became his kingdom, because he won it by the spear. And this does follow through. We see this in later kings. This is something that applies to Seleucus as equally as it applies to Ptolemy, as equally as it applies to the Antigonids later. Also interesting is the rulership cult, which is one way that they could at least put themselves forward as being divinely written to rule. So with the Seleucids, for example, Seleucus the first Nicator was said to be an analog for Zeus, whereas his son, Antiochus the first Soter, was Apollo. And this sort of switches back and forth with the family gods being mainly Apollo there. And when we look for the Ptolemies in Egypt, they're very much Zeus-based. You'll see a lot of their coinage represents that.
Isis and Osiris.
Yeah. So you'll see the eagle of Zeus on tons of Ptolemaic coinage.
Yeah.
And coming back, the second part of the question on how areas affected the kings themselves, and we look to Egypt with their incestuous relationships. The first practitioners of that were Ptolemy II Philadelphos, which means a lot of people interpret it as brother lover, but Adelphos is a sibling, so it's a sibling lover. He and his sister Arsinoe were the first two to reportedly marry out of love. They didn't actually have any children together. Ptolemy III is...
My eyebrow is raised.
Yeah. Ptolemy III is the son of Ptolemy II by his first wife, whose name escapes me at the moment. I believe it might have been a Berenike, but I'm not 100% sure. They didn't actually have children together. But this idea of incestuous relationship pops up, and it is not limited to the Ptolemies. The Seleucids were pretty incestuous. Realistically, anytime you had an interdynastic marriage, it was still incestuous because, as I said, they are related in some form or another, and the longer time goes on, the closer they become again because of these marriages. So chances are everyone's related to everyone by some point, and because you don't you don't marry below the ruling class. So I think that does add an interesting twist to legitimacy again, because where do you have claim? If your nephew, say, is the ruler of Egypt, are you his regent, as we see with Antiochus IV and his nephew Ptolemy VI? They started an entire war over that because he claimed his nephew was the king, therefore he is his regent, and as the ruler of the Seleucid Empire, should he also be the regent for the Ptolemaic Empire, which they clearly did not like, which resulted in an entire Syrian war and the intervention by Rome in the end. But it is a sticky issue, legitimacy and right to rule.
Right. And so I suppose that moves us to a discussion perhaps about ruler cults. As far as I know, up until this point, there was no concept of perhaps, obviously in Egypt and in Persia and in these places, but as far as in the Greek world, you never really offered up sacrifice or incense or anything like that to a ruler. And this was something that was, I would say, easily accepted in the East because they had all these traditions of Pharaoh being divine, of the Shah being divinely ordinated by Ahura Mazda. They don't have this in the Greek tradition. And so this is a great area of contention all around the Hellenistic world, because there was this dichotomy of people who were rejecting and accepting these divine ruler cults.
I actually once argued that on a midterm essay, that the prevalence of ruler cults in the East was because of tradition there, and Prof actually failed me on it.
What?
Yeah, it's the worst thing that's ever happened.
That's the like prevalent mainstream view.
It wasn't his interest, I guess.
I mean, there are nuances and implications to it because Orientalism is a thing, and so there's often this argument like, oh, Eastern people are more servile and disposed to tyranny, and they're more mystical and superstitious in their thinking, and therefore they accept the fact that a man could be God more likely. Whereas that's not necessarily what I'm arguing.
Yeah.
But that has been argued in the past, and that's something that I think you have to work your way around.
Mm-hmm.
But that sucks.
Yeah, I in my reasoning, I thought the Achaemenid Empire and their practice of the King of Kings. And,
yeah, but he was not God.
Yeah, he was.
He was like chosen by God.
Yeah, exactly. And that's how I framed the question. But I think there are certain nuances to why it succeeded now and it hadn't in the past. I mean, even with Alexander, his push to be the son of Zeus, Amun from Egypt, the equivalent after his visit to the Siwa Oasis, was really the start of this idea of a ruler cult, of a living god king by association. And this is not at all lost on any of the successors, I think.
Yeah, they piggyback on Alexander's self-delusion.
Yeah.
Or maybe self-actualization, depending which perspective you want to look at it from. But the Ptolemies definitely pick up on this notion. The problem with thinking that you're divine is when you think that you're divine and nobody else is. That's where you have to draw the line. It's either all divine or none of it's divine.
Yeah, and I mean, it is interesting looking at the Ptolemies. You have the pharaonic cycle of switching between Horus and Osiris. I believe it's the two. Yeah, where the living king is Osiris, and then when that king dies, he becomes Horus, and his son becomes Osiris, the living representation of the god as the ruler of Egypt. And like I mentioned not long ago, we have Seleucus I and Antiochus I, respectively, believing themselves to be...
Okay, hold on. Just before you move on, let's get this out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
The Seleucus and the Seleucids are around the Near East, and then we have Antiochus is back in Greece proper and Macedon.
You're thinking of the Antigonids.
Oh, yes.
So at this time, it's a little shifty. Cassander, who would have ruled Macedonia as the king of Macedonia, died in the very early 3rd century in the 290s. What we end up with there is the Antigonid dynasty, who...
I have to interject, sorry, because I made a point of doing this. When we talk about Cassander dying, everyone look up dropsy, and then continue.
Goatsy?
Dropsy. It's the disease he died of.
Yeah.
Oh.
If you want to know what suffering is.
Yeah. So...
Isn't it a fever?
Yeah, fever and grotesque sickness.
I'm all about that grotesque sickness.
I forget all the symptoms, but there is a gathering of fluids.
Nice.
Yeah, so, anyway, the kingdom that takes root in the Macedonian homeland is that of the Antigonids eventually. Getting there is a little bit more sticky than the other kingdoms. There are some in-between people. There is Alexander IV, who eventually, is long since dead now. We have to look basically to Demetrius, Antigonus' son. So, again, Demetrius was at the Battle of Ipsus in 301. He survived, whereas his father did not. He sailed off. So Demetrius went back to Greece. He spent his time consolidating there. He controlled what are known as the fetters of Greece, the fetters being the chains of Greece, which are Demetrius, Chalcas, and Corinth. Extremely important for trade as major ports throughout the Greek peninsula. And eventually he makes his way northward into Macedonia, and we get the next Antigonus, Antigonus II, and third, and then all the way up till the end of that dynasty. Yeah, so by this time, those are the three major players, those three kingdoms. The Antigonids, the Seleucids, or the Seleucids, if you prefer,
Yeah.
and the Ptolemies.
Yeah, in Egypt. Yes. And so, yeah, ruler cults. Did the Antigonids try to...
The Antagonids did have, of a sort, they were the most traditional of the kingdoms, being located in Macedon. But the easy example we could point to is Demetrius Poliorcetes, that's Demetrius I, and the Ithyphallic hymn to Demeter, written in Athens for him, equating him to being a divine child of Demeter himself, establishing his divinity. So they also had this idea of divine rulership.
And that's hence the name of their child. That was a very propagandistic name.
So as an example, and talking about why it was successful was, I think, partially because of the Greek colonies in the east.
Yeah.
The entire Ionian coast, whether they believed it or not, when the king could offer protection and all he wanted to be was called a god, they were pretty likely to give that, I think. There were a lot of tumultuous things happening at this time. It was 280 that the first Celtic Gaelic people
Under Brennus
invaded Greece, and then only a year later when they were invited into Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, by Nicomedes of Bithynia, and then they never left, so we get the people called the Galatians. The Galatians are the scourge of Asia Minor for some time before they become the
reserve army.
Yeah, the reserve military class of Asia Minor a few hundred years or
the
even
wealthiest
less.
buffer state of Asia Minor.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mentioned in an earlier lecture that these are the guys that put Gaul and Galatia.
Yeah. And I mean, if you look, the Galatians have a strange spot in kind of their ethnic background, because they are ethnically descendants of Gallic tribes.
They're Celts.
They are Celts.
They decapitate people and stick their heads in.
But they quite early on start taking on other names.
They do, and
of various Eastern Anatolian and Western Anatolian peoples.
Yeah, so what we have are these people primarily in three major tribes, the Tectosages, the Trochmi, and the Hilistobogi. These are the three major Galatian tribes in Asia Minor. Depending on the source you're reading, they'll have different names of themselves as an ethnic group overall. You'll see in Polybius, he calls them Keltoi, Celts. He also calls them Galatai, the Galatians, which is where we get that name. If you move into Latin authors, such as Livy...
For the most part, Galli. The odd time Galatai.
In Livy calls them Gallograici.
He for the most part calls them Galli. He has what's his name call them Gallograici. He has Vulso call them that.
Yes,
because
not to be mistaken with the Galli, who are the priests of of the Great Mother.
he has Vulso call them Gallograici, so as to be pejorative that they are effeminate Gauls.
Yes, so this is the point.
So
these Gauls, having been living near the soft Greek people on the Ionian coast, became softer themselves.
But the third-person narrator calls them Galli.
Yes. So coming back around to the start of this point, the Ionian coast people needed protection from these Gauls. So what the Hellenistic kings could offer was protection, and in order to get in that Hellenistic king's graces, you would revere them as a living god.
Ah, so that's how they convinced the most hard-lined, logical people in the world, probably, the Ionian coast Greeks.
They're used to being subject people too by this point for a while.
Oh, subject, yeah, of course, but, they're in one of the hottest, territories.
Yeah. And then that's what you get at this time, too, right? Is that old ideal of freedom for the Greeks, which doesn't die. It keeps going right up until, at least Flamininus in 196 declares freedom of the Greeks to get their favor.
You get Zeus Eleutherios, who becomes a very popular god.
Yeah, that's very early on, yeah.
Yeah, and so Zeus the Liberator,
who
is this kind of Dionysiac Zeus and Dionysus, obviously, as well. I
Yeah,
guess.
the problem when you're trying to think of gods, though, is there's this problem when you're asking whether these people believe they're gods or not, is what is the conception of a god to them?
Well, in this regard, if you want to see what it actually looks like, it would be that somebody pays a lot of money to have a temple built and to have a statue created, or you would have an old idol brought into, from a shrine or something, brought into a very big and lavish, expensive temple. And then it becomes like a state-sponsored...
No, but what is the conception of theos or deus? Like, what is in the mind's eye of a Latin or a Greek or a
Depends who you're
Cappadocian?
talking to.
Yeah. Like, what does it mean to be God? So I'm just saying, when people are skeptical about how anyone could believe these people are gods,
Yeah.
what does it? We have a very Judeo-Christian, not even like,
Yeah.
a very, very universal, omniscient, omnipotent conception of God that of course a person can't be that, but
Yeah.
But what is a god to the ancient?
Well, I mean, the Latins wrestled with this when, in the transition between divine Julius and Augustus as a god.
Well, Augustus never openly...
Right, but there was cult to Augustus.
Yeah, in the provinces.
As evidenced by the bronze tablets.
He didn't prevent it in the provinces.
That's generally how we look at it. Is he didn't say no, but he didn't acknowledge it.
And he was buying into this Seleucid tradition. But I think that the initial idea in the Roman world was that you had a divine mind, and that it was your mind or your genius that was divine, and not your person. And then eventually they just did away with that concept, because that's how they explained Julius Caesar. And they said that he had a genius divinus or something along those lines.
I do not know.
You've never encountered that?
No, I've never. I don't work in the same kind of things. So
Right.
I've only really come across Suetonius and Cicero's letters concerning that declaration.
But anyways, we're getting a bit late.
So, stepping back a little bit, I think something that's important to mention is going back to the acknowledgement as a living king. It wasn't a big thing until actually Antiochus III. He was the first to declare himself a living god. And also important to Antiochus III
was the first?
Is that his wife, Laodice III, was the first queen to be acknowledged as a divine entity. Up till this point,
not the Ptolemies?
Well, in the Seleucid Empire. In the Seleucids.
Yeah, I think the Ptolemies
the Ptolemies
you just blew my mind if that was
default divine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I was like, Jesus, my world just turned upside down.
They worked hard to associate themselves with the traditions of Egypt, which did good things and bad things for them. Depending on how you look at any given thing.
Depending on how you look at your sibling.
Didn't they also not really give a shit about the Egyptian people at the same time?
The priestly class.
I mean, one of the facts that comes up a lot is that Cleopatra VII, the very last Ptolemaic ruler, is the only one to have ever spoken Egyptian.
They ingratiated themselves with the priestly nobility.
Yes.
That's why tradition. That's why the old gods.
Yes. And they also, the Ptolemies had a very strong civic programming. That's why, take Ptolemy III, for example, his epithet is euergetes, the good doer, basically.
Yeah.
They built
the museum.
They built the library, the lighthouses. Yeah.
I don't know when the Serapeum was built, but it was in honor of Serapis, who was an entirely Hellenistic. Yeah. It's the Apis bull, which is Osiris in the flesh.
Yeah.
And Zeus.
Oh yes, that's right.
Yeah, so Serapis is a full-on syncretism with a flower pot on his head.
Yeah.
Of the Apis bull, who is Osiris in flesh, and Zeus.
It's unfortunate we only had a century of a Hellenistic Jewish state, because it would have been interesting to see where that would have won.
Yeah. Well,
That'll be something that I think I'm going to do all on a lecture of its own.
Yeah, I don't think they were too interested in being a Hellenistic
They-
Jewish
oh,
state either.
The
Not all of
Hasmoneans. The
them.
Hasmoneans.
The Hasmoneans
They
were-
rebelled against the Hellenism, then they all of a sudden just got into the most.
Yeah, they don't have
Yeah.
terms like the abomination of desolation. Herod was a Hasmonean.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just like that the Jews had a 100-year-long Hellenistic state.
But anyway, back to the 2nd century, or the
Sorry.
3rd century rather. So busy century too. Lots happening. The Syrian wars were a big deal. 9 in total, lasting far longer than just the 3rd century in scope. Between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies over Syria.
When was the last one? Was it between the Agrippus
Oh, that was-
Antiochus VIII?
It depends which one you consider
That was the
last
first
one.
time ISIS was messing up Syria.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, at first, Syria was messing up ISIS.
Yeah.
So the first Syrian war was a conflict between Antiochus I and Ptolemy II, wherein they fought during the 270s over a small bit of land called Koile Syria, which means hollow Syria, which was extremely fertile, very well wooded in the Levant.
Yeah, that whole area between the Levant and
Yeah, remember the word coile is also the word for womb.
Yes. So they fought over this for that reason. The term Syrian War, which is what we've applied to essentially every war between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, is sort of a misnomer because sometimes it wasn't even fought over Syria, and usually it was fought over more than just Syria.
It's the involvement of Syria.
Yes, it's the involvement of those two powers. And I mean, to varying degrees, both sides had success over the centuries. Things changed hands. The Ptolemies, for example, took Babylon, and they took Seleucia on the
They took
tires.
Babylon.
Yep, they
Wow.
at least attempted to. Ptolemy III marched
Egypt takes Babylon.
out. They did not keep these things, mind you.
Yeah, this was
Um,
back in the initial turmoil of the beginning
Yeah.
when the Mediterranean was just completely in flux.
One of the major themes of the Hellenistic period is dynastic strife. They love to fight each other over who should be king. So, for example, between the Seleucids, we have the War of the Brothers.
Yeah, there was no tradition to call upon.
No. The War of the Brothers, which takes place around the 240s BC between Antiochus Hyrax and his brother Seleucus II. They fought for control. Hyrax went into Asia Minor to reclaim it for the Seleucids from those filthy Attalids who pop up. This doesn't work. Hyrax claims himself an independent king. They fight. They both die, killed by Galatians, actually, ironically enough, in their own forces. Then, for the Ptolemies, for example, I mean, you could go with the very latest example being the strife between Cleopatra VII and her brother Ptolemy XIII, which is when the Romans came in. But earlier than that, you have the 6th, 8th, 9th Ptolemies and the Cleopatras fighting over a joint ruleship of 3 at one point, which nobody liked. And back over in Macedon, you have Perseus and his brother Demetrius, who one mysteriously dies of poisoning an Amphipolis.
So it really is, like you say, it's Game of Thrones with fewer dragons and more incest.
More incest, yep. Absolutely. I mean,
He was crediting Brett for those listening.
yeah. So, I mean, it is a period of
Vanity.
conflict of so many types, which makes it arguably the more interesting historical period of the time, but for some people that confusion is not as great. The 3rd century also sees the rise of the state of Pergamon, which becomes another major Hellenistic kingdom. It's not one of the initial successor kingdoms. It rises up about halfway through the 3rd century thanks to a man named Philotyros, who was an official treasurer for the Seleucids at Pergamum, who sort of slowly floats away from Antiochus and Seleucus and anyone there. He starts to establish himself because Pergamum was the location of a massive royal treasury. Eventually he dies, he's replaced.
Worth noting that I'm going to say Pergamum usually, and he's going to say Pergamon, so if anyone So if anyone's confused, it's just
It's the same thing.
the same thing.
Same thing.
Greek ending versus Latin ending, depending
Yeah.
on which one you got used to using.
So, the rise of the Attalids, named after their first king, Attalus the First. They were an interesting dynasty as well, also hereditary, sometimes going from an uncle to a nephew instead of a son.
Yep.
This is the kingdom that I
That confused
consider...
Justin, and he got that genealogy wrong.
Yeah, and the Attalids are usually the kingdom I consider the little tattletale to Rome. It's kind of their role in the next 100
No.
years.
Ptolemy was...
No, the Attalids are way worse for it until 133 when they become a Roman province. The Attalids love to run to Rome, which happens with the Ptolemies. I'm not denying that. I mean, we might look at, for example, Eumenes II and the entire conflict surrounding the Third Macedonian War, going to Rome and saying, hey, Ptolemy and Antiochus are planning to take over Macedonia and split it up between the two of them, so you should fight them now. That sort of thing. The other way around. Philip and the Seleucids are planning to take over Egypt and divide it up between them and all the wealth and resources.
Remember, the Romans have a relationship with Egypt.
They do, but this is largely based on hearsay information concerning letters passed between them that may or may not have ever existed.
That's true. The Romans weren't yet. Yeah, that's
the Romans. By that time, the
Yeah.
Romans were a big deal in the East.
No, I was gonna say they weren't yet accustomed to Greek diplomacy.
Yes, so it creates an interesting situation.
It's funny that they really just were not used to this Greek double speak, and that's you can see that in their initial generosity and quick loss of patience in all matters.
Oh yeah, aren't there isn't every letter among Hellenistic kings just so overloaded with titles and
Yes.
flatteries
And
And
oaths. It's
oaths,
a big
oaths that
thing.
they break every year.
Like Antiochus, great king.
Let not this peace be broken, and if it is,
and everyone's just circle jerking each other to
Yeah.
give each other legitimacy
Well,
because
that's
they know
just
if
it.
the one guy doesn't have legitimacy, then theirs is also
It falls
in
apart.
trouble.
I mean, we have royal letters. We have tons. There's a volume
so many.
by Michelle Austin, reprinted in 2008, called Sources, Hellenistic Sources, from 323 to 30, which contains all these. And the one letter in specific I'm thinking of is a letter from the Attalids to a small city in Asia Minor, wherein they send a letter and say, "Hey, great guy, you're the best. We want a gym. We want to become a civic center. We want to have something that we can
want
be
to
proud of."
lie.
And yeah, essentially,
yeah,
and,
we want to why.
and he mails back, "All right, I mean, I can do that for you. You've been good. You can have your gymnasium. We'll give you all these things.
Your baths.
I'm so beneficial."
Yeah,
Yeah,
you ergites.
yeah, exactly. And indebting
Beneficial
themselves to the
is the
people
word.
in a roundabout
They
way.
are benefactors. That's what they call themselves.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, while we're speaking about, we spoke a little bit about protection from the Galatians. One of the major shticks that some of the early successor kings, including Attalus I, played off of was their ability to protect certain peoples from these Galatians. That's why it's theorized that he defeated the Galatians in a battle. Whether the battle happened or not is irrelevant. He claims that by protecting these people from the Galatians, he deserves the title Soter, Savior. So that's why Attalus I Soter, why possibly we have Antiochus I Soter, why we have Ptolemy I Soter.
Yeah, well, and it ties into this whole thing about savior gods that we've
Yeah,
been talking about.
exactly.
These kings associate themselves with dying and rising savior gods quite frequently, and so
And 3rd century, I mean, the Bactrian kingdom's still flourishing.
Oh yeah.
and that's something that I'm going to have a whole
Separate.
lecture on.
It's a separate
Yeah.
little world. On its,
Yeah.
I mean, it communicates with Syria.
Yeah.
And it's relevant there, but
I mean, aside from our major Hellenistic kingdoms, quote unquote Hellenistic kingdoms, so the four we have, to recap quickly, the Attalids, the Antigonids, the Ptolemies, and the Seleucids, but that is not all that's happening at this time. We have a number of kingdoms around Asia Minor which are not part of any of those four, such as the Pontic kingdoms, so Pontus, Bithynia, Cappadocia. These all have their own dynasties which are starting to take the royal style of the Hellenistic kingdoms eventually.
Oh, and still lots of like tribal
Exactly.
type confederations of horseback nomads
Yes,
and
and
Turkic peoples.
And in the 3rd century, it's also worth noting that Rome is going to go from owning most of Italy to all of Italy,
Yes.
to Sardinia, Corsica, Sicily,
they will likely encounter
chunks of North Africa,
problems with Gaul.
Gauls,
Yes.
Hispania.
Rome at this time, just as a quick non-lecture covering sentiment, is that
Well, just to give a
they've won the First Punic War, which has gotten them their first provinces. Rome is expanding quickly. Rome is a big expander at this time, and they are moving east slowly, and by the end of the 3rd century, they will be in the east.
Before the Second
strongly.
Punic War, they are already in Illyria,
Yes.
and during the Second Punic War, they're in Macedonia and along the main body of the Peloponnese.
Yes, so specifically by that I mean they have their first non-Italian province at the end of the First Punic War, which is Sicily.
Yeah.
Then they
which
take
was
Sardinia a few years later.
Greek before.
Sicily's not Greek. The interior is Sicilium.
Yeah, it's Sicilian.
So it's pre-Indo-European, non-Phoenician.
Yeah, but the coasts are like covered in Greek polis.
The major city being Syracuse.
Yes, but it's the
not
same.
a purely Greek island.
And
It's heavily Greek
and
influenced.
Lilybaeum
as
is Carthaginian.
Southern.
the whole
Italy
western,
itself,
the whole
Tarentum.
western end of it is Carthaginian, and
Yes.
most of the stuff around Mount Etna is native,
Yes. So
pre-settlers.
this is Italian-Greek contact. We'll put it that way.
Yeah.
So Italy is becoming an issue. Actually, in the book that I like so much by Malcolm Arrington, one of the chapters is called Clouds in the West, which is referring to the coming of Rome, which is a huge game changer for all of the Hellenistic kingdoms. Some of the major first conflicts with Rome are the Macedonian Wars with Philip V. I like to call him Philly V.
I forget where we were. I forget where we were.
What were we talking about?
Dude, we were like talking about kings and gods, man.
There was stuff happening. And
There were Romans,
Oh,
and
yeah,
it was
we
the clouds in the west.
Yeah, okay. So, what do you want to talk about now? Do you want to talk about like the coming of Rome, or a little bit, or?
Well, let's talk about more generally how the Hellenistic age could be distinguished from the age that preceded it. If we can talk about major changing points.
In culture, the erosion of civic identity.
Yeah.
The universal citizen, or like there were people who,
As a point of pride, claimed Athenian citizenship, but there were people who called themselves citizens of the world. This is the birth of cosmopolitanism.
Right.
And anyone who knows what the idea behind cosmopolitanism is knows to weep every time they see that word attached to 24 sex acts that will make his toes curl.
Oh yeah. Or the drink.
Cosmopolitan.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
What a poor word.
Yeah, I discussed in one of the previous lectures on mystery cults how the rise of cosmopolitanism, it eroded civic values and gave birth to the rise of the individual.
Yeah, the idea of like a chosen people, like a Jewish notion, was really falling out. That your gens, your ethnos, or whatever, was separate or above others, was dying, and thus universal principles start to arise. This is the culture that creates Christianity. The idea of a universal religion for the nations.
Right. And I mean, Stoicism paves the way.
So much paves the way, yeah. And Roman roads quite literally paved the way.
Oh yeah, that is a good point to make. But again, that's a bit
Yes.
bit later. Well, artistically, things change, of course.
If you want to talk about the style change, we get what's called the Baroque style in statuary. Over-muscled people.
Oh, I
the
love all
statue-
those like lats that just hang
Yeah.
down the side of the buttocks.
I mean,
Oh, yeah.
essentially, if you're
Extra
looking...
muscles inserted in the knee
Yeah.
area.
It looks like they have like synthol Hercules.
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, exactly.
Synthol Hercules.
The Farnese Hercules, maybe that's the one I'm thinking of.
Well, he doesn't have too much synthol, I can tell you that.
It basically looks as though everything is extremely exaggerated. So what we have in terms of art is we have the Archaic period, where you get Amandine eyes, you get very general features, like small indications.
Shape.
Geometric patterns.
Yeah, so things like this. As we move into the classical period, we start to get an interest in depicting body mechanics more dynamically.
Verisimilitude.
We get the idealism, the idea of idealism, wherein everyone is young and beautiful, features are soft, everything is perfect. These principles follow into the 4th century, where we get the great artists Scopas, Praxiteles, Lysippus, those sorts of figures.
And it becomes a focus on ugliness. which
Yes,
is
and
interesting.
then what we have next is the hyper-realism. The idea that every single bone should have a 6-pack. And that's what we're talking about now,
Wait,
that Baroque-style
shouldn't?
art should have a 6-pack. And
But-
that's why
but it
this Heracles has muscles on ribs where there are no muscles.
But can we say that's realism?
No, that's hyper-realism. That's the over-the-top.
Over
Yeah.
realism, right?
So-
Surrealism.
Yeah, if you will. So if you look up Hellenistic
Surreal.
sculptors, Hellenistic art, what you're getting is that exactly. And I am thinking of a particular statue of Heracles that they did, Hercules, where he's so ridiculously muscled that it makes no sense at all. But that was
Is
the
that
art
the
of
one
the
from
time.
the Baths of Caracalla?
I'm not sure.
He's just beefy.
Yeah,
He has the club beside him, and he just looks like he has like ass growing out of ass muscle.
I'm almost confident that it's the Farnese Heracles is what it's called.
Yeah, Farnese Hercules.
Yeah, so look that one up.
Yeah,
What we get next is the verism, the aged people. That's really a Roman concept
Yeah.
that comes in.
Well, what about the dying Gaul and that sort of thing?
That's a
That's
vestige
the,
of
Pergamon.
the last Pergamene art. Yeah, followed through on a classical. So we have the altars of Zeus at Pergamon, where you see a very decent relief sculpture. We do have the dying Gaul. The idea of emotion being depicted in art. So you speak of the dying Gaul. I can think of another dying Gaul that I actually saw in the National Museum in Athens, where you come to a point of sympathy with the statue. You see this person is very tired, and you can tell they're dying. They've dropped their arms. They're looking up with a pained expression.
It's worth noting, though, for the art of the period, so much that we think like the Pergamene school of this like Baroque emotional stuff, how much of a shaky foundation this whole school of thought of reconstruction of the art of the period.
Yeah, I mean, an art historian would know far better than any of us would. I mean, I'm repeating
Right.
things I've learned. I specifically speak about statues because I like statues. It's like my second runner-up to military history.
Worth
which
noting,
is
we
my
don't have a
interest.
single Seleucid statue.
No.
Not
Were
that we
they-
can identify a Seleucid ruler.
Well, they were
No.
bronzes, right?
Marble or bronze? We
There
have
are statues of Laodike.
no. There are statues that have been attributed to Laodike. Sheila mentioned this at the last Seleucid study.
It's a tough. So we have possibilities, but no sureties.
Yes.
As far as
There's-
that goes.
And the only reason we think it's Laodike is because it was made in the